Have you ever looked into a mirror and thought you saw something move that shouldn't have? When you walk through a forest, it's almost as if time slows down. You don't really think about much, or at least, not in the way you would when you're in the city. The noise, the clutter of everyday life fades into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. You let the silence wrap itself around you like a warm, familiar blanket. There's the gentle rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze, the distant sound of birds calling out to each other, and the soft crunch of twigs breaking beneath your boots. It's not just the sounds either, it's the smell. There's something about the fresh scent of damp earth and pine needles that makes your lungs feel cleaner with every breath you take. It reminds you of simpler times, even if you've lived your whole life surrounded by concrete buildings and the buzz of city lights. There's a part of us, I think, that yearns for this kind of environment, even if we don't always realize it. No matter how comfortable we are in our modern, busy lives, there's always a pull toward the woods, toward the wild. Maybe it's because deep down, we know that the forest was here long before we were, and it'll be here long after we're gone. The air in a forest is different too. It feels lighter, cleaner, like the trees are constantly working to keep it that way, filtering out all the impurities. Every time the wind blows through the branches, you feel it, a sense of clarity, as if your mind has been reset, your thoughts calmer than they were just moments before. Sunlight filters down through the canopy above, dappling the forest floor in patches of golden light, playing a game of hide-and-seek with the shadows. It's beautiful, it's peaceful. But if you stay long enough, you start to notice the little things. At first, it's the soft sounds that catch your attention, the way the wind changes direction, the way the shadows seem to shift when you're not looking, the way certain parts of the forest seem darker, deeper, even during the day. There's something about a forest that's both inviting and unnerving. It's a place of calm, sure, but there's something else too, something just beneath the surface that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Forests are funny that way. They give you what you want, the quiet, the escape from the noise of the city, but they also remind you in subtle ways that you're not in control here. This isn't your home, it never was. That's why I've always found national parks a bit strange. They give us the illusion that we're in control, that we're safe. We walk along the well-marked trails, we camp in designated areas, and we feel like we've tamed nature, like we've made it our own. But the truth is, we're still just visitors. The forest doesn't belong to us, and it never will. It lets us in because it's ancient, because it doesn't care. We're not a threat to it, no matter how much we like to think we are. And when we leave, it continues on, as it always has. That's something my father used to tell me. He's been a park ranger for as long as I can remember. And to him, the forest isn't just a job, it's his life. He spent more time in the woods than he ever has in the city. While I was growing up, I never quite understood his love for it. I mean, I liked nature well enough, but I didn't see why anyone would want to spend so much time out there, away from the comforts of modern life. My idea of enjoying the outdoors was swimming in a lake or skiing down a mountain, not hiking for hours just to look at trees. It just didn't make sense to me. And don't even get me started on the animals. I'm not scared of them exactly, but there's something unnerving about being surrounded by wildlife, knowing that at any moment a deer or a bear or some other creature could come crashing through the underbrush. Then there were the bugs. They were the worst, always buzzing around, always biting. I hated them, I still do. But my dad loved all of it. The peace, the animals, even the insects. He would come home after a long shift in the park and tell me stories, sometimes about the campers he helped, but more often than not, about the strange things he saw while patrolling at night. Ghostly figures moving through the trees, strange sounds that couldn't be explained, eerie lights flickering deep in the forest. Of course, back then I thought he was just trying to scare me. I was young, and his stories felt like the kind of thing parents tell their kids to keep them from wandering off. As I got older, though, I started to see things differently. Not that I believed in the forest creatures he used to talk about, but there was something about the woods that intrigued me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a thrill, I started getting into horror movies, reading ghost stories, and I guess, in a way, it made me want to experience that kind of fear for myself. Not the kind of fear that paralyzes you, but the kind that gets your heart racing, that reminds you that you're alive. That's probably why, when my dad offered to take me with him on one of his night shifts, I agreed without hesitation. I knew it was his way of trying to connect with me, especially since we'd grown apart over the years. He was always busy with his work, and I was busy growing up. We didn't talk much anymore, and when we did, it felt like we were speaking different languages. My mum thought this trip would be a good way for us to reconnect, and I guess I believed her. We arrived at the park just after sunset. The drive had taken longer than I expected, and by the time we got there, the sky was a deep shade of blue, with only a few stars peeking through the clouds. My dad's shift started at 10 p.m. and would last until 6 in the morning. I'd never been on a night shift with him before, and as the Jeep rumbled down the dirt road leading into the forest, I couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Not that I would ever admit that to him. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees as we drove deeper into the woods. The road twisted and turned, and soon, the park's entrance was far behind us. I hadn't realized how big the park was. I mean, I knew it was large, but driving for what felt like an hour without reaching the heart of the forest was something else. It was like the trees were never ending, stretching out on both sides of the road, their branches reaching out like arms trying to pull us in. After what felt like forever, we finally reached the cabin. It was a small wooden structure, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A single light bulb flickered above the door, casting long shadows across the ground. 2 watchdogs, chained to posts near the entrance, barked as we approached, but my dad paid them no mind. Before I could get out of the car, my dad stopped me. "Listen," he said, his voice unusually serious. "There are some rules you need to follow while you're here. I know they might sound strange, but they're important, got it?" He handed me a piece of paper with a list of handwritten rules. I glanced at it, expecting the usual stuff. Don't wander off, stay close, be careful of wild animals, but as I read further down the list, my brow furrowed. The first few were straightforward enough. Don't go out alone in the park. Always have a working contact device with you. Don't leave marked paths unless instructed and equipped. But then the rules started getting strange. Don't leave food out and lock the trash bins. Always keep the whistle and the badge on you. If you see a man without an arm, don't help him. Your family is not here. Remember that. There is no reason for you to hear their voices from outside. Lock your car doors even when you're driving. Check the marks on the trees. There are only 3 types of marks. All triangles, red, yellow, and green. Any other marks are not ours. Don't follow them. If the whistling sounds close, it means they're far. If it sounds far away, it means they're near. Beware of dead blue. I stared at the list, confused. I looked up at my dad, raising an eyebrow. "Dad, I'm not a kid anymore. You can't scare me with this kind of stuff." "I'm not trying to scare you," he said, his expression unreadable. "Just follow the rules, okay? You wanted to come, so act accordingly." I nodded, but my eyes lingered on one rule in particular. If you see a man without an arm, don't help him. What kind of rule was that? "And what's this about the whistling and dead blue?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling a knot tighten in my stomach as I pointed to the strange rules on the list. My dad glanced at the paper in my hand, then back at me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, some of these rules have been passed down from the older rangers. Superstitions, you know. Things that supposedly happened out here a long time ago. Most of it is just stuff to keep you on your toes. But it's better to be safe than sorry. As for dead blue, well, it's more of a code word." "A code word for what?" I pressed, feeling that knot in my stomach tighten even more. He hesitated, which wasn't like him. My dad was the kind of man who always had an answer, always knew exactly what to do. Seeing him unsure made me feel uneasy. "Dead blue is what we call a type of silence," he said, his voice lower now. "It's not a normal silence. When you're in the forest, there's always noise, even if you don't realize it. Insects, birds, wind in the trees. But when dead blue happens, Everything stops. No wind, no animals, no nothing. It's like the entire forest is holding its breath, and that's when you need to leave as fast as you can. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. So, if it goes completely quiet, I just run? Exactly, he said, nodding. If Dead Blue happens, don't think, don't look around, just get out of there and don't stop until you're safe. I didn't know what to say to that. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of one of those horror stories he used to tell me as a kid. But the way he said it, the way his eyes looked when he spoke about it, made me believe him, or at least made me not want to question it. Right, I said finally, folding the paper and stuffing it into my jacket pocket. Let's just hope it doesn't come to that. My dad gave me a small, tight smile, but his eyes didn't relax. I followed him out of the jeep and toward the cabin, feeling the weight of the dark forest pressing in on me from all sides. The watchdogs had stopped barking now, their chains clinking softly as they lay down in the dirt, watching us with their beady eyes. The cabin was even smaller than it had looked from the car, barely big enough for the two of us to stand in without bumping into each other. There was a tiny desk cluttered with papers and maps, an old mini-fridge humming in the corner, and a small, flickering TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. My dad tossed his jacket onto the back of the chair and sat down at the desk, flipping through the stack of papers. So, what do you do out here all night? I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling more uneasy by the minute. The cabin felt cramped, like the walls were too close together, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood. Mostly paperwork, he said, shrugging. I check in with the other rangers, make sure everything's running smoothly. Every few hours, I'll do a patrol around the area, make sure no campers have wandered off the trails, but honestly, it's usually pretty quiet. Quiet, I repeated, glancing around the room. You mean nothing ever happens out here? Not often, he said, leaning back in his chair. There are a few wild animals, sure, but they stay away from the cabin, and most of the time, the campers stick to the trails. So yeah, it's usually pretty boring, just me in the woods. I didn't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. Part of me had expected, maybe even hoped, that something exciting would happen, that I'd get to experience some of the thrill I'd been craving. But at the same time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The thought of something going wrong in the middle of this vast, dark forest sent a shiver down my spine. My dad must have noticed the look on my face, because he stood up and opened the mini-fridge, pulling out a couple of cans of orange juice. I remembered you liked this brand, he said, tossing me one. I caught the can and smiled despite myself. Thanks, Dad. We sat in silence for a while, sipping our drinks and listening to the faint hum of the mini-fridge. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches of the trees against the windows. The flickering light bulb above us cast long, jittery shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness just beyond the cabin's walls. After an hour or so, I started to feel my eyelids drooping. I didn't want to fall asleep. Part of me still wanted to stay awake, just in case something interesting happened. But my body had other ideas. Before I knew it, I was slumped over in the chair, my head resting on the desk as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. It felt like I had only been out for a few minutes when my dad shook me awake. I sat up, blinking in confusion as I tried to remember where I was. What's going on? I mumbled, rubbing my eyes. I got a call from Martin, my dad said, his voice tense. Someone from one of the campsites is missing. We need to go look for him. I blinked again, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. Wait, we? You mean me too? Yeah, he said, already grabbing his jacket. You'll stay in the car, but I need you to come with me. It'll be quicker that way. I could hear Martin's voice crackling over the radio on the desk, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. My dad's face was tense as he grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door. Let's go, he said, motioning for me to follow. I stumbled after him, my mind still groggy from sleep. We climbed into the jeep, and my dad started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark forest as we pulled away from the cabin. I glanced out the window, the trees rushing past us in a blur of shadows and moonlight. As we drove deeper into the forest, the knot in my stomach returned. Something about this didn't feel right. I could hear my dad talking to Martin over the radio, but his voice was low, and I couldn't make out the details. We had been driving for about 15 minutes when my dad suddenly stopped the Jeep. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Listen," he said. "Martin is going to come pick me up. You're going to stay here, locked in the car. Turn off the lights and wait for me. I won't be long." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What? You're just going to leave me here?" "It'll be safer this way," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Before I could protest, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the Jeep, disappearing into the darkness. I watched as the beam of his flashlight bobbed through the trees, then vanished completely. I was alone. I locked the doors, just like he'd told me to, and turned off the headlights. The forest around me was completely dark now, the only light coming from the sliver of moon hanging in the sky. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and I felt the knot in my stomach tighten even more. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes scanning the darkness outside the window, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the trees, standing tall and still, like silent sentinels guarding some ancient secret. Then I heard it, a knock on the window. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I whipped around, staring at the window, but there was nothing there, just the dark, the shadows. Then I heard it again, another knock. This time I froze. My dad's voice came from outside, muffled but unmistakable. "Kev, open up, it's cold out here." I stared at the window, my blood running cold. How could that be possible? He had just left, and I hadn't heard Martin's car come back. The knot in my stomach turned into a sharp, stabbing pain as the words from the list flashed through my mind. "Your family is not here. If you hear their voices, ignore them." My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, dialing my dad's number. It rang and rang, the sound filling the silence in the car, but there was no answer. Then finally he picked up. "Kev, what's wrong?" His voice was clear, calm. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "Dad, someone's knocking on the window. It sounds like you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and steady. "Kev, listen to me very carefully. Don't open the door. Turn off the lights and stay quiet. I'm coming to get you." Outside, the knocking continued. "Kev, it's me. Open up." The voice was so familiar, so warm and comforting, but I knew it wasn't him. It couldn't be. My dad was still out there, somewhere in the dark, and whatever was outside the car wasn't him. I turned off my phone's screen, the only light in the car disappearing as I pressed myself against the seat. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I wondered if whatever was outside could hear it. I clutched the phone tightly in my hand, my knuckles turning white as the knocking on the window grew more insistent. "Kev, open the door. It's cold. I saw you in there." The voice, still sounding exactly like my dad's, sent a shiver down my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my back harder against the seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to. I remembered the rule. Don't open the door. Don't talk to them. Don't listen to their voices. But how was I supposed to sit there, frozen, while the thing outside pretended to be my dad? I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would somehow make it all go away. Maybe if I didn't acknowledge it, it would leave. The knocking stopped for a moment, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. I held my breath, waiting, hoping that whatever was out there had moved on. But then it spoke again. "Kev, I need your help." The voice was quieter now, pleading. "Something happened. I fell. You need to open the door." It was terrifying how much it sounded like my dad. Every word, every inflection in his voice was perfect. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed it. But I did know better. I gritted my teeth and stayed silent, keeping my eyes squeezed shut. The silence dragged on, heavy and oppressive. Then there was a sound that chilled me to the bone. Footsteps. Slowly they circled the car. Whatever was out there was walking around, trying to find a way in. My heart pounded harder, my breath shallow as I tried to stay completely still. The footsteps stopped at the driver's side window. My breath hitched as I heard the faintest tap on the glass. "Kev, please," the voice whispered, barely audible but terrifying in its calmness. "I need you to help me." I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to respond, not to react. My fingers fumbled with the phone as I dialed my dad again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. The phone rang once, twice, then... "Kev, are you okay?" His voice was sharp, tense but real. It was him. I felt a flood of relief wash over me, but I didn't dare move. "Dad," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Something's outside. It sounds like you, but I know it's not." "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could hear beneath it. "Stay where you are. Don't open the door. Don't talk to it. I'm almost there." The footsteps outside the car stopped again, and for a moment, everything was still. The wind had died down, the trees were motionless, and I realized that the forest had gone completely silent. Not a single sound, not even the faint rustle of leaves or the chirping of crickets. My stomach twisted as I realized what was happening. Dead blue. I held the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white as the silence pressed in on me from all sides. This was the silence my dad had warned me about. The unnatural kind. The kind that meant something was very, very wrong. "Dad," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. "It's dead blue." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then my dad's voice came through, more urgent now. "Kev, you need to stay calm. Don't make a sound. I'm almost there." I could barely hear him over the pounding of my own heartbeat. The silence outside the car was suffocating. It was as if the entire forest had been swallowed up by something, and all that was left was this unnatural, oppressive quiet. Suddenly, there was a soft scraping sound on the roof of the car, like nails dragging across metal. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as the sound moved from one side of the roof to the other. Whatever it was right above me now. I didn't dare move. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the ceiling of the car, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. The scraping stopped. Then a voice, soft and sweet, came from directly above me. "Kev, I'm sorry I scared you." It was my dad's voice again, but this time it was more than just a voice. It felt like it was inside my head, crawling under my skin. "You know I love you, right? I just need you to open the door. Please, just unlock it. I'll take care of everything." I bit my lip, hard enough to taste blood, forcing myself not to respond, not to move. Tears stung my eyes as I sat there, paralyzed with fear. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. Then, out of nowhere, there was a bright flash of light. Headlights. Real headlights. They cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the car, the trees, and the figure that stood just outside the window. I gasped. It looked like my dad, but something was wrong. Its face was too pale, too stretched, its eyes dark and empty. It smiled at me, but the smile was all wrong. Too wide, too forced. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees, melting into the shadows, like it had never been there at all. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding as the real car pulled up beside me. The headlights flickered for a moment before my dad stepped out, flashlight in hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with concern. "Kev," he said, rushing toward me, "are you okay?" I unlocked the door and practically fell into his arms, my body shaking uncontrollably. "It was out there," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "It looked like you." "I know," he said, holding me tightly. "I know." For a moment we just stood there, the headlights casting long shadows across the trees. The wind had picked up again, rustling the branches above us, and the oppressive silence of dead blue had lifted. But I could still feel it. The presence. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been pretending to be my dad, it was still watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even now. "We need to go," my dad said finally, guiding me back toward the car. "We're not safe here." I nodded, too exhausted and terrified to argue. We climbed into the car, and as my dad started the engine, I glanced out the window one last time. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows longer, deeper, and in the distance, just beyond the reach of the headlights, I thought I saw something move. It was only for a second, a brief flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the trees, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I turned away, pressing my back against the seat as we drove away from the cabin, from the darkness, from whatever was out there. As the trees rushed past us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever had been watching us in the forest wasn't done with us yet. And deep down, I knew that this wouldn't be the last time I encountered Dead Blue. That night changed everything for me. The forest wasn't just a place of peace and beauty anymore. It wasn't just a place where people went to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. It was something much older, much darker, and much more dangerous than I had ever realized. There are things out there in the woods, things we don't understand, things that don't belong in our world. And sometimes, when you least expect it, they find you. So if you ever find yourself in the forest, remember this. If the silence is too loud, if the world feels like it's holding its breath, don't wait. Don't look around. Don't wonder what's happening. Run, because you don't belong there, and the forest has a way of reminding you. Stay away from Dead Blue. I moved to Japan from America, hoping for a fresh start and to escape the constant political noise back home. But that wasn't the whole story. The real reason was more personal. I had been in an online relationship for 4 years with a girl named Inari. My parents didn't know about her. They probably suspected something, but every time I tried to tell them, they shut me down before I could finish. They believed in old-fashioned ideas. People should stick to their own. Hearts belonged with hearts, and so on. But I wasn't going to let their beliefs hold me back. I was an adult now, and I wanted to live my own life. Inari was beautiful. She was a college student studying to become a veterinarian, and we had spent countless hours talking online, getting to know each other. Now, I was finally going to meet her in person. As I walked through the airport in Japan, I looked around, searching for her. Then I spotted a woman holding a sign with my name written in kanji. I smiled and walked up to her. When she saw me, her face lit up, and we both walked towards each other. "Hey, it's so good to finally meet you in person," I said, extending my hand awkwardly. Even though we had known each other for years, I suddenly felt nervous, unsure if I should go for a hug. She laughed, grabbed my hand, and pulled me into a hug. "It's good to meet you too, Jason," she said warmly. I chuckled, relaxing into the hug. "How have you been?" "Great. My parents can't wait to meet you," she said, releasing me from the hug. "Come on, let's go." Inari led me to her car, and we drove out of the busy airport area. Traffic in Tokyo was pretty bad, but after we left the city, things started to calm down. We drove for a while, heading out into the countryside. I looked out the window, taking in the wide open fields and small houses scattered across the hills. At one point, Inari pointed to a large temple sitting on top of a hill. "My father works there," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Wow, he's a monk." "Kinda," she replied, keeping her eyes on the road. "Kinda?" I repeated, confused. "What does that mean?" "It's complicated," she said, not offering any more explanation. I muttered, turning back to the window. As we passed a field, I noticed something odd, something tall and white flapping in the wind. It looked like one of those inflatable tube men you see outside stores, but as we got closer, I realized it was just a scarecrow. It wasn't very big, maybe 6 feet tall, but the way it moved in the wind made me feel uneasy. 5 minutes later, we pulled into the driveway of her parents' house. The sun was just beginning to set, and my stomach growled in hunger. The house was traditional, with sliding doors and a wooden porch. It looked like it had been there for generations. Inari parked the car and turned to me. "Okay, before we go in, I should tell you something. My parents are pretty strict when it comes to traditions. My last boyfriend got kicked out for not taking off his shoes when he came inside." I laughed nervously. "Don't worry, I'll be careful. Can't be worse than my parents, right?" She smiled but didn't say anything. Instead, she handed me a bottle of wine and a small gourd. I stared at them, confused. "What's this for?" I asked. "They're gifts for my parents," she explained. "Wine for my mum and sag for my dad. It's a tradition here. You give gifts when you meet the parents of someone you're serious about." I hesitated, feeling a little out of place. "But I didn't buy these," I said. She smiled. "It's fine. You can pay me back later." I sighed, nodding. "How much do I owe you?" "About 70 million yen," she said with a playful grin. My eyes widened and I almost choked. "What?" She laughed. "Relax, it's about $500. I let out a deep breath, still shocked. "Oh, okay." I counted out the money and handed it to her, feeling a little less anxious now that I knew the price. We entered the house and I quickly kicked off my shoes by the door, remembering her warning. The house was warm and smelled like something delicious was cooking. An older man with graying hair tied back in a bun peeked out from the kitchen and smiled when he saw us. "Inari-san, you're back," he said. "And you brought company, I see." "Yes," Inari replied, standing a little straighter. "This is Jason, my boyfriend." I noticed a slight edge in her voice, like she was daring him to say something. The man, Goro, smiled warmly and waved us inside. "Hinata, we have company," he called out to someone in the house. Then he turned back to me. "I'm Goro. It's good to meet you, Jason." "Nice to meet you too, sir," I replied, holding out the gourd. "We brought you something." Goro chuckled as he took the gourd from me. "Ah, my favorite. You must really want to stay on my good side," he joked. "Come. My wife will be down in a minute. For now, help me set the table." Inari and I helped set the table, laying out plates and bowls of food. There was way more food than I had expected for just 3 people. I frowned, wondering why there was so much. "You made quite a lot of food," I said. Inari looked nervous, but Goro laughed. "I eat a lot," he explained, patting his stomach. He wasn't overweight, but he was clearly in good shape for his age. I nodded. "All right." A moment later, an older woman entered the room. She had graying hair like Goro, and her face was wrinkled but kind. She smiled when she saw us. "Oh, we have a guest," she said. "Goro-san, why didn't you tell me?" "I did," Goro replied, grinning. I quickly stepped forward and handed her the bottle of wine. "This is for you," I said politely. Her eyes widened slightly as she took the bottle. "Oh my, Inari must really want to keep you around. Not that I blame her," she added with a teasing smile. Inari blushed and looked down at the table. "Mom," she muttered, embarrassed. "Come now, let's eat," Goro said, interrupting the teasing. He sat down at the table and waited for everyone to join him. We all put our hands together and said, "We humbly receive," before starting the meal. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about Japan, my life in America, and my plans for the future. At one point, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something white fluttering outside the window. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. "Jason, have you thought about what kind of work you'll do here in Japan?" Hinata asked with a smile. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "I plan on doing some job hunting tomorrow. In the meantime, I'm happy to help with any chores or tasks around the house until I get settled." Hinata smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you." "You can stay in the guest room," Goro added, giving me a serious look. I blinked, realizing what he meant. My face turned red, and I quickly nodded. "Of course, sir." At that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from Inari. "When everyone goes to sleep, look under your bed." I frowned and glanced at her, but she was quietly eating, not looking at me. Before I could think too much about it, Hinata spoke up. "No phones at the table, please," she said kindly. "Right, sorry," I said, putting my phone away. Goro noticed my hesitation and looked at my plate. "I see you haven't touched your rice," he said. I shrugged, feeling a little awkward. "Yeah, I've never been a big fan of rice." Goro chuckled, his voice filled with humor. "Well, if you're going to live in Japan, you might want to get used to it. Rice is a big part of the meals here." I smiled and nodded, taking a small bite of rice. To my surprise, it was delicious. The rice had a rich flavor, and the pork mixed in made it even better. "How did you make this so good?" I asked, genuinely impressed. Goro grinned. "It's a family secret. Almost anyone who tries our rice ends up liking it." I smiled and took another bite. It was a strange feeling, enjoying something I thought I didn't like. After dinner, Goro asked me to help him with the dishes, and as we worked, he told me more about the temple where he worked. "The temple has been in my family for 17 generations, Goro said, scrubbing a plate. "It was burned down during the Sengoku period by a samurai clan called the Mochizuki. They were against the Buddhist monks and tried to destroy everything. Statues, scrolls, even the monks themselves," Goro explained, rinsing off a dish. His voice grew more solemn as he shared the story. "They had a scorched earth policy when it came to Buddhist temples. They destroyed everything they could. But of course, history has a way of keeping important stories alive." I was fascinated by the story. "How did the monks survive?" I asked, curious. Goro nodded as if he had expected the question. "The monks got wind of the attack before it happened. They prepared by hiding their most precious artifacts in a secret cave beneath the cliffs near the temple. When the Mochizuki arrived, all they found was an empty temple to burn down. The monks hid in that cave for years, and when the war ended, they came back up and rebuilt the temple." I frowned, surprised by the tale. I've never heard of the Mochizuki clan. It seems like trying to wipe out a religion would be a bigger part of history. Goro shrugged. "Many monks wanted to erase the Mochizuki from history, to wipe them away as punishment for what they did. But some of us believe that all history, even the bad parts, should be remembered. It's part of the reason why the temple stands today." There was a brief silence between us as we finished the dishes. Goro patted me on the back, making my shirt damp with dishwater. "You've had a long day. You should go rest. First room to the right," he said with a kind smile. I thanked him, gave a small, tired smile in return, and made my way to the guest room. As I walked down the hallway, I thought I saw something white fluttering around the corner again. It looked like cloth, but I quickly shook off the feeling. It had been a long day, and I was ready for bed. The guest room was simple but cozy, with a futon laid out neatly on the floor. I collapsed onto it, grateful for the soft blankets. The long day, the jet lag, and the uneasiness of meeting Inari's family had taken a toll on me. I closed my eyes, ready to drift off into sleep. I woke up suddenly, a strange noise at my door pulling me out of my sleep. I wasn't a heavy sleeper, so even the slightest sound usually woke me up. I rubbed my eyes and grabbed my phone to check the time, 4 a.m. As I blinked away the sleep, I noticed something strange. A thin, white substance was seeping under the door. It looked like paint, glue. I couldn't quite tell in the darkness. I grabbed my phone and used it as a flashlight. When the light hit whatever was coming under the door, my heart stopped. It wasn't paint. It wasn't glue. It was a pair of hands, flat, white, and thin, like pieces of cloth. I stared in disbelief as the hands wriggled closer, followed by strands of short black hair that peeked under the door, and then a forehead. The thing creeping under the door was like something out of a nightmare. Its head was impossibly thin, with deep, empty eye sockets that seemed to stretch into darkness, yet it was no thicker than a piece of paper. Fear gripped me, but my body reacted on instinct. I jumped out of bed and burst through the door, stepping over the thing as if it were a discarded rug. As I ran past it, I heard a horrifying shriek as the door scraped against its skin. The creature bunched up like a towel, crumpled against the wall. I didn't stop to look back. I sprinted down the hall toward Inari's room. I needed to warn her, but when I reached her door, I stopped. There was a glowing piece of paper stuck to the doorframe. A strange symbol on it pulsed with light, and I found I couldn't touch the doorknob. It was like an invisible barrier was stopping me, and the paper glowed even brighter when I tried to get closer. I looked around frantically, my heart racing. Goro's door had the same glowing paper on it. I was trapped in the hallway, and worse yet, when I turned back to look, the creature was standing up again. Its two-dimensional body twisted and flapped like paper caught in the wind. It moved toward me with jerky, unnatural movements. I cursed under my breath and looked for an escape. The front door was down the hall, past the dining area. If I could make it there, I might be able to escape. But What about Inari and her family? Could I really leave them behind to face this thing? My mind screamed at me to run, but my heart wouldn't let me abandon them. I ran into the kitchen instead, scanning the room for anything that could help me. My eyes landed on a rack of kitchen knives. I grabbed 2 of them, gripping them tightly in my hands. The creature rounded the corner, its body flapping and twisting as it came closer. It didn't make a sound, but the sight of it filled me with dread. Screaming, I charged at it with the knives. I stabbed them into its body, pinning it against the wall. The creature let out a horrible, silent shriek, writhing in pain as it tried to tear itself free. Its paper-like arms wrapped around mine, and I struggled to pull back, flailing my arms to shake it off. I knew I had to find another way to stop it. My mind flashed back to the text Inari had sent me. "Look under your bed." I raced back to the guest room, hoping that whatever she had hidden there would help. I slid to the floor and looked under the bed, spotting something small and white. It was a sword, a short wakizashi. I grabbed it, and as I did, I noticed there was a piece of paper wrapped around the sheath with a message written in kanji, "Kill the Kunakuni." I unsheathed the sword, and it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, the blade reflecting light in an almost unnatural way. I could see the creature in the reflection. It was moving toward the door. I gripped the sword tightly and spun around, swinging the blade wildly. The creature recoiled in terror, its face twisting in fear. I swung the sword again, and this time I struck its arm. A glowing blue line appeared where the blade cut through, and the creature let out a loud, piercing scream. Its once silent mouth now revealed rows of sharp black teeth as it lunged at me. It bit down on my shoulder, its mouth like that of a lamprey. I screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I plunged the sword through its body, ripping it downward. The creature's limbs tightened around me, but after a few more desperate stabs, it finally went limp. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. My shoulder throbbed with pain, but the creature was finally still. I took one shaky step forward before collapsing onto the floor, exhausted. When I woke up, I was no longer in the house. I was lying on a soft bed in a peaceful room filled with warm light from lanterns. Above me stood a large statue of Buddha, its hand raised as if offering protection. I could hear voices nearby, Inari and Goro arguing softly. Hinata sat beside me, tending to the wound on my shoulder. "Don't worry," she said softly when she noticed I was awake. "You're safe now. Goro isn't happy that you used his wakizashi, but he's glad you survived." I stared at her, still trying to process everything. What was that thing?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "That was a kunakune," Hinata explained calmly, her hands moving gently as she applied fresh bandages to my shoulder. "A yokai, a spirit. You were the first person who didn't run from it. You're also the first person to survive." I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up. "The first." Hinata nodded. "There were others, Inari's previous boyfriends. They didn't make it. You're the third one we've brought here, and the first to survive. That's why you absorbed its ki." I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in my shoulder. "What do you mean I absorbed its ki?" Hinata gave me a sad smile. "You're connected to it now. The energy from the Kunakuni is inside you. That's why you need to train, to learn how to use that energy and protect yourself." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. My life had changed in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. I had come to Japan to meet the woman I loved, but now I was part of something much bigger, something much more dangerous, and there was no turning back. This is where my story begins and where my new life starts. Whatever comes next, I'll face it, and I won't be alone. I have Inari, and together we'll face the unknown. I moved to Japan from America, seeking a fresh start and trying to escape the suffocating world of politics and corporate stress. On the surface, that was what I told everyone. The truth, but not the whole truth. I was also moving to meet someone special. For 4 long years, I had been in an online relationship with a woman named Inari. We'd connected in a way I hadn't thought possible, and I finally took the leap to meet her in person. The whole thing was kept secret from my family. My parents wouldn't understand. They were traditional, rigid in their beliefs about relationships, and would have never approved of me falling in love with someone who didn't fit into their narrow worldview. They believed in living a certain way, and Inari didn't fit their mold. But I was an adult, and I was ready to live my own life without the burden of their approval. Inari was beautiful, smart and kind, someone who made me feel alive. She was a college student studying to be a veterinarian, and from the endless conversations we had online, I felt like I already knew everything about her. Yet, there was a nervous excitement in finally meeting her in person. When I landed at the airport in Tokyo, I scanned the bustling crowd. Amid the sea of people, there she was, holding a sign with my name, Jason, written in kanji. Her face lit up when she saw me, and my heart skipped a beat. I had seen her countless times on video calls, but standing before her now felt surreal. "Hey, it's really you," I said awkwardly, extending my hand, suddenly unsure of how to greet her. A handshake, really? After all this time, a handshake felt strange. Inari laughed, her warm, melodic voice cutting through my nervousness. She ignored my hand and pulled me into a tight hug. "It's so good to finally meet you," she said, her voice soft but full of excitement. I chuckled, wrapping my arms around her. "It feels unreal, doesn't it?" She pulled back, looking into my eyes. "Yeah, it does." There was a moment of silence, the kind that feels comforting rather than awkward. "My parents are really excited to meet you," she said, breaking the pause. "Let's go." We walked to her car, a small but practical sedan, and drove out of the city. As the traffic and chaos of Tokyo faded behind us, I started to relax. The countryside was a stark contrast to the concrete jungle I had been used to back in America. The air felt different here, cleaner, fresher, and the fields stretched for miles, dotted with traditional houses on distant hills. At one point, we passed a large temple perched on a hill, standing tall and proud against the sky. Its wooden structure gleamed in the golden light of the setting sun. "That's where my dad works," Inari said, pointing at the temple. "Really? He's a monk?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Kind of," she replied, her tone slightly cryptic. She didn't elaborate. "Kind of?" I asked, but she didn't seem keen on explaining, so I let it drop. As we drove deeper into the countryside, the peaceful landscape took on an eerie tone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the hills. I noticed something strange, a figure standing in the middle of a field. At first, I thought it was one of those inflatable tube men you see outside car dealerships, but as we got closer, I realized it was a scarecrow. But not just any scarecrow. It was completely white, flapping oddly in the wind. It stood tall, its thin body bending unnaturally as the wind picked up. The sight sent a chill down my spine. We turned a corner, leaving the scarecrow behind, and began ascending a hill. Inari's home sat at the top, nestled among trees, with the temple not too far in the distance. When we arrived, the sun had almost set, and my stomach growled loudly. The long flight and nervous excitement had made me forget how hungry I was. Inari parked the car and turned to me. "My parents are traditional," she said, her expression serious. "My last boyfriend didn't last more than a few minutes because he forgot to take off his shoes when he entered." I laughed, though the nervousness in my stomach grew. "I'll be careful. How bad can it be?" She handed me a bottle of wine and a small gourd. "Here, give these to my parents. Wine for my mum and sake for my dad. It's custom to bring gifts when meeting the parents for the first time." I hesitated. "I didn't buy these, though." She smiled. "Don't worry, you can pay me back later. Trust me, it's worth it." "How much?" I asked, already dreading the answer. 70,000 yen, she said, her smile turning playful. I blinked. "Wait, how much is that in dollars?" "About 500, she said, her amusement growing as I struggled to process the number. I handed her the cash, trying to keep my cool. I guess there's no turning back now, huh? We entered the house, a traditional home with wooden floors and sliding doors. I kicked off my shoes at the entrance, remembering her warning. Inside, I was greeted by the warm smell of food cooking and the sight of her father, Goro, standing by the kitchen. "Inari-san, you're back," he called out. His eyes shifted to me and he smiled. "And you brought company." Welcome. This is Jason, Inari said, her voice carrying a hint of pride. He's my boyfriend. Goro's eyes studied me for a moment before he smiled again. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jason. I handed him the gourd. I brought this for you. Sake, my favorite, Goro chuckled, accepting the gift. Inari must really want to keep you around. Just then, her mother, Hinata, appeared from another room. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Welcome, she said softly, and I handed her the wine. I hope you enjoy this, I said, trying not to sound too formal. Hinata's eyes widened slightly. Oh my, Inari must think very highly of you to bring such a fine gift. Inari blushed, folding her arms. Mum, stop it! The meal was traditional. Rice, miso soup, grilled fish, and pickled vegetables. As we sat down to eat, Goro led the table in a brief prayer. I tried my best to follow along, repeating the words he said. The conversation flowed easily enough, with Goro and Hinata asking me about my life in America, my job, and what I planned to do in Japan. But there was a strange tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a flash of white outside the window, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Have you thought about what kind of work you'll do here? Hinata asked, her voice breaking through my thoughts. I'm still figuring that out, I admitted. I'll start job hunting soon, but I'm happy to help out around the house in the meantime. That's good to hear, Goro said, nodding in approval. A man should always contribute to the household. After dinner, I helped Goro with the dishes. As we worked, he told me more about the temple and its history. It had been in their family for generations, surviving through wars and natural disasters. I could hear the pride in his voice as he recounted stories of the monks who had hidden precious artifacts in a secret cave to protect them from invaders. By the time we finished, I was exhausted. The long day, combined with the emotional weight of meeting Inari's parents, had drained me. I excused myself and headed to the guest room. The room was simple but cozy, with a futon laid out on the floor and a small window overlooking the garden. I collapsed onto the futon, the soft blankets, a welcome relief after the long day. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was something watching me. At around 4 a.m., I woke to a strange noise. It was faint, like the sound of something sliding across the floor. I blinked groggily, reaching for my phone to check the time. The room was still dark, and my mind was fuzzy with sleep. But then I saw it, something white, seeping under the door. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe some kind of shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was hands, white flat hands like paper, slowly creeping under the door. I bolted upright, my heart racing. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door. The hands were joined by strands of black hair and the edge of a face with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stretch into nothingness. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I jumped to my feet, threw open the door and ran. The next moments were a blur. I ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever that thing was, it was close, too close. I could hear it behind me, its strange, papery limbs flapping in the air as it followed me. I rushed toward what I thought was Inari's room, but when I reached for the door, my hand hit something invisible, like there was a barrier between me and the door. I noticed a glowing paper stuck to the doorframe, its eerie light pulsing in the darkness. I turned around, panic setting in as I saw the creature. It was standing upright now, its body flailing unnaturally as if it were being blown by a wind only it could feel. It was distorted, its two-dimensional form rippling, twisting, as if it were made of thin fabric. I ran back down the hall, toward the kitchen, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Where was Inari? Why was this thing chasing me? What the hell was happening? I reached the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I spotted the rack of knives and grabbed two of them, gripping the handles so tightly my knuckles turned white. I spun around just as the creature appeared in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Without thinking, I charged at it, the knives raised. The blades sank into its body with an odd, muted resistance. like cutting through thick cloth. The creature let out a soundless shriek, its body writhing as I slammed it against the wall, pinning it there with the knives. But it wasn't enough. The thing's arms, those flat, unnatural arms, wrapped around mine like paper snakes. It began to pull itself free from the blades, tearing its own skin in the process. I stumbled backward, panic flaring as I realized the knives weren't going to stop it. That's when I remembered the text message from earlier. When everyone goes to sleep, look under your bed. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I raced back to the guest room. I skidded to a stop, dropped to the floor, and frantically reached under the bed. My hand closed around something cold and smooth, a sword, a small, snow-white blade wrapped in paper. "Kill the Kunakune," the note read. I pulled the sword from its sheath, and a soft blue glow radiated from the blade. It wasn't a normal sword. It felt alive in my hands, vibrating with a strange energy. I didn't have time to question it. The creature, the Kunakune, was already at the door, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I swung the blade wildly, and the creature recoiled, its form twisting in fear. The blade seemed to hum in my hands, its glow growing brighter as I slashed through the air. The creature lunged at me, its mouth, once flat, now stretching into a gaping, black hole filled with rows of needle-like teeth. I screamed and drove the sword into its body, the blue light exploding through the room as the blade cut through the creature's skin. It let out a horrible wail, a sound so piercing that it made my ears ring. But I didn't stop. I kept stabbing, kept slicing, until the thing collapsed on the floor, twitching, its body turning to ash with each strike. I stood there for a moment, gasping for air, the sword still glowing faintly in my hands. The room was silent now, eerily silent. I dropped to my knees, exhausted, my entire body shaking from the adrenaline. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard footsteps, gentle, cautious footsteps, approaching from the hall. I looked up to see Inari standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. You killed it," she whispered. I nodded, too drained to speak. Inari knelt beside me, carefully taking the sword from my hands. "This was my blade," she said softly, "from when I became an onmyoji." Her words barely registered in my foggy mind. "Onmyoji?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her expression somber. "It's a long story, one I should have told you sooner." Later that night, after I had cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes, Inari and I sat together in the living room. She explained everything: the temple, the creatures, the ancient spirits that roamed these lands. The Kunakune was just one of many yokai, a spirit that twisted and contorted reality, driving those who saw it to madness. Her father, Goro, was more than just a caretaker of the temple. He was a guardian, a protector of these ancient spirits. And Inari, like him, had been trained as an onmyoji, a spiritual practitioner capable of combating these forces. The sword I had used belonged to her, a relic from her own initiation into the role. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "I've been here for a day, and I've already almost died." Inari looked down, guilt evident in her eyes. "I didn't want to scare you away," she admitted. "Every time I've brought someone here, they didn't survive. I thought if I gave you the blade, you might have a chance." I sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I guess I should be thankful." She smiled faintly. "You should be. Most people don't survive their first encounter with a yokai." I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything she had told me. Spirits, ancient guardians, a world I had never believed in before now. It felt surreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. "I still don't understand," I said after a long silence. "Why me? Why now?" Inari's expression turned serious. "Because you're different. Jason, you have a strength in you, something that drew the spirits to you. My father saw it too." Her words made me uneasy. I didn't feel strong. If anything, I felt like I was hanging by a thread. "So what now?" I asked, unsure of what my next move should be. "You'll stay," Inari said firmly. "You'll train with us, learn how to protect yourself, how to fight these spirits, It's the only way you'll survive. I wanted to argue, to say that I didn't sign up for this, that I just wanted a normal life. But deep down, I knew she was right. There was no going back now. The next few days were a blur of training and strange encounters. Goro was a tough teacher, pushing me to my limits both physically and mentally. He taught me how to wield the sword, how to sense the presence of spirits, and how to protect myself from their influence. It was exhausting, and more than once I thought about giving up. But every time I considered walking away, I remembered the creature, the kunekune, and the terror I had felt. I couldn't go back to my old life, not after everything I had seen. I was part of this world now, whether I liked it or not. And so I stayed, I trained, I fought. Little by little, I became part of their world. And in doing so, I found a strength I never knew I had. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.